Lucia, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dom. Just to introduce myself, I'm Lucia Costanzo. I'm one of the committee members of the Trollope Society, an executive committee member. What I'm going to do is I'm going to speak for probably, I think about sort of between 20 and 30 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity to sort of have a discussion at the end. And then also what I'll do is I'll recommend some books that you might find interesting if you'd like to take this topic further. So that's great. Thank you very much. Okay. Anthony Trollope's memorial in Westminster Abbey describes him as a public servant and writer. In the Trollope Society, we rightly concentrate on his literary legacy, though his post office career is remembered, often in the context of the introduction of post offices. I must own up to being a civil servant as well as a Trollopian. As my day job, I work on environmental policy in central government, and before that worked for the Royal Mail Group. So this part of Trollope's life has a special resonance for me. In my view, what's so interesting in Trollope's works is how he described the world of the civil servant in the mid-19th century, in both his autobiography and several of his novels. In fact, his novels can be described as primary sources because so few other references to civil servants' work at the time exist. Trollope joined the civil service at a period of great societal and economic change. Until early Victorian times, the main functions of the British civil service were to raise money from taxation and then spend it on the army and navy. In the mid-18th century, there were about 17,000 civil servants. By the end of the 19th century, there were 107,000 of them, of which just under 77,000 worked for the post office. The introduction of a postal system to reach even the most rural household needed significant numbers of staff, even though the postman's routes have been meticulously planned by a certain official called Anthony Trollope. There were also considerable changes in areas such as education and the development of the railways and telegraphy. In fact, the modern state, as we know it today, was being created. This era also started the call for the patronage-based system of the civil service, which stemmed from the role of early civil servants as the king's advisors. The new civil service needed those with the aptitude and skills to build the empire, rather than those with contacts or the wherewithal to buy a post via a broker. Even in 1855, people were still looking to purchase places in the civil service. In the Civil Service Gazette of the 17th of February that year, a young man placed the following advertisement. A splendid nugget of pure gold weighing upwards of 24 ounces will be given by the advertiser to any lady or gentleman who will legally procure for him a permanent situation under government upon a railway or otherwise, bringing in about £150 a year, and where trust and confidence may be relied on and not much writing required, has been a non-commissioned officer of cavalry. The story of Anthony Trollope's professional life is well documented. His transformation from a hobbledehoy, living off his impoverished and grieving family in Bruges, to post office clerk was an action of necessity. It was that or a career in the Austrian Navy, apparently. In his autobiography, published after his death in 1883, we hear of his recruitment to the post office of his day, which was achieved by personal contacts. There was something that comforted me in the idea that I need no longer be a burden, a fallacious idea, as it soon proved. My salary was to be £90 a year, and on that I was to live in London, keep up my character as a gentleman and be happy. But as yet the £90 a year was not secured to me. On reaching London, I went to my friend Clayton Freeling, who was then secretary of the Stamp Office, and was taken by him to the scene of my future labours at St Martin's le Grand. Sir Francis Freeling was the secretary, but he was greatly too high an official to be seen at first by a new junior clerk. I was taken, therefore, to his eldest son, Henry Freeling, who was the assistant secretary, and by him I was examined as to my fitness. The story of that examination is given accurately in one of the opening chapters of a novel written by me called The Three Clerks. If any reader of this memoir would refer to that chapter and see how Charlie Tudor was supposed to have been admitted into the Internal Navigation Office, the reader will learn how Anthony Trollope was actually admitted into the Secretary's office of the General Post Office of 1834. I was asked to copy some lines from the Times newspaper with an old quill pen, and at once made a series of blots and false spellings. "That won't do, you know," said Henry Freeling to his brother Clayton. Clayton, who was my friend, urged that I was nervous and asked that I might be allowed to do a bit of writing at home and bring it as a sample on the next day. I was then asked whether I was a proficient at arithmetic. What could I say? I'd never learned the multiplication table and had no more idea of the rule of three than of conic sections. "I know a little of it," I said humbly. Whereupon I was sternly assured that on the morrow, should I succeed in showing that my handwriting was all that it ought to be, I should be examined as to that little of arithmetic. If that little should not be found to compromise a thorough knowledge of all the ordinary rules, together with a practiced and quick skill, my career in life could not be made at the post office. Going down the main stairs of the building, stairs which I believe have been now pulled down to make room for sorters and stampers, Clayton Freeling told me not to be too downhearted. I was myself inclined to think that I'd better go back to the school in Brussels, but nevertheless, I went to work and under the surveillance of my elder brother made a beautiful transcript of 4 or 5 pages of Gibbon. With a faltering heart, I took these on the next day to the office. With my calligraphy, I was contented, but was certain that I should come to the ground among the figures. But when I got to the Grand, as we used to call our office in those days, from its site at St. Martin's-le-Grand, I was seated at a desk without any further reference to my competency. No one condescended even to look at my beautiful penmanship. That's one of my favourite parts of the autobiography. So, as Trollope himself stated, the story of his recruitment was fictionalised in The Three Clerks. The Three Clerks was clearly influenced by real experiences, and indeed it can be considered to be a primary source. We must not forget that the work of a clerk at that time involved mainly copying out letters by hand, because there were no means at all of mechanical reproduction. Bureaucracies of subsidiary grades were still to come, so there were few opportunities for drafting letters and developing policy. Johnny Eames is only allowed to draft letters from the secretary because he's been befriended by lofty persons. Most of the work must have been mind-blowingly dull. No wonder the Three Clerks were constantly on the lookout for a good time. As Trollope biographer C.P. Snow said, "There is little evidence that in 7 years at St. Martin's-le-Grand he was ever given a job that would have vaguely interested a sentient human being." It's easy to see how a postal surveyor's role in Ireland would have appealed to Trollope. The character of the chief clerk at Weights and Measures, Sir Gregory Hardlines, who is so enthusiastic about the system of civil service examinations, was based on Sir Charles Trevelyan, and the excellent Sir Warwick Westend, full of the best intentions, was, as Trollope said, a feebly facetious name for Trevelyan's associate and fellow reformer, Sir Stafford Northcote. In The Three Clerks, I introduced a character under the name of Sir Gregory Hardlines, by which I intended to lean very heavily on that much-loathed scheme of competitive examination, of which at the time Sir Charles Trevelyan was the great apostle. Sir Gregory Hardlines was intended for Charles Trevelyan, and as anyone at the time would know who had taken an interest in the civil service, we always call him Sir Gregory, Lady Trevelyan said to me afterwards when I came to know her husband. I never learned to love competitive examination, but I became and am very fond of Sir Charles Trevelyan. Sir Stafford Northcote, who's now Chancellor of the Exchequer, was then leagued with his friend Charles, and he too appears in the Three Clerks under the name of Sir Warwick West End. But for all that, the Three Clerks was a good novel. The Northcote-Trevelyan report is the foundation of a permanent neutral administrative body working to the elected government of the day. Sir Stafford Northcote first served in the civil service at the Board of Trade and then as private secretary to Gladstone. Later, he became a Conservative MP, serving Disraeli as Chancellor of the Exchequer and Foreign Secretary. His biggest impact on the civil service came in 1853, when he and Treasury Permanent Secretary Charles Trevelyan were commissioned by Gladstone to look into the operation and organisation of the entire civil service. There had been attempts to reorganise before, focused on the East India Company, and to recruit those with an aptitude and then train them at a dedicated staff college in specific skills such as finance and local languages. But this approach did not win. Trevelyan and Northcote made 4 recommendations. 1, recruitment should be made entirely on the basis of merit by open competitive examinations. Entrants should have a good generalist education and should be recruited to a unified civil service and not a specific department, so to allow interdepartmental transfers. Recruits should be placed into a hierarchical structure of classes and grades, and promotion would be on the basis of merit and not on the grounds of preferment, patronage, or purchase. With this order in council establishing the Civil Service Commissioners in 1855, the British civil service as envisaged by Northcote and Trevelyan was born. The creation of the commissioners to oversee open recruitment based on examinations was the single most important factor in the development of a unified civil service dedicated to serving the public. The examination system was swiftly established and proved its worth. But to modernise the examination questions were pretty difficult, as we shall see from example examination questions from 1855. The civil service looked for young men of superior education, although individual departments had different requirements. While not all departments demanded that candidates must be unmarried and without family, a precondition for being considered for appointment as a lieutenant of revenue police, most required high standards of attainment in arithmetic, English grammar and composition, history and geography, along with excellent handwriting and spelling. If you wanted to join the Treasury, though, you had to be prepared to answer examination questions on the first 3 books of Euclid and translate a passage out of Latin, French, German, or Italian. Here's a couple of sample questions for examinations for junior clerks. Elementary arithmetic. A person having £5,074, 18 shillings, 4 6pence, lays out 1/3 in goods, which he sells for £2,316, 5 shillings and 10pence. How much has he at last, and how much has he gained? Then find the income tax on £2,382, 7 shillings and 6pence at the rate of 6pence in the pound. For geography, candidates were asked to draw an outline map showing the overland route to India, and also to mention 7 colonial possessions of Great Britain, specifying wherein their political and commercial importance to this country. With English grammar, they were asked to construct sentences exemplifying the use of the relative pronouns in the possessive and objective cases. Initial reaction to Northcote-Trevelyan report was hostile, and even Queen Victoria declared herself horrified that the running of the country might be handled by professional bureaucrats. The independent civil service commissioners were established in 1855, but it wasn't until 1870 that the main recommendations of the report were put in place, and that success in a competitive examination became the primary means of entry to the service. Trollope didn't really approve and was really somewhat scathing. But in this article, The Civil Service as a Profession, from the Cornhill magazine in 1861, he reluctantly admitted the following: "Let it be acknowledged that the Civil Service Commission has done some good. I am not one of those who believe in Medea's cauldron. I do not think that the chopping up and boiling will change the bones and flesh of the body. The amelioration which has taken place, and which is taking place in the civil service, is part of the progressive movement of the nation, would have come to pass, and was coming to pass, without any commission whatsoever. But it is well to have something to say in praise, and that something may as well be said here as elsewhere. A preliminary examination of candidates for the service by an independent board has no doubt been beneficial. And while it is simply a test of the fitness of the person nominated, it must, I think, continue to be so. Among other things, it assists men to achieve that independence of which we are speaking. A lad who knows that he has been judged fit for work, which he has to do, and who bears with him into the service this mark of approbation, is taught to conceive that from the first he makes a fair bargain with the public, which is his paymaster. Entrance to some parts of the civil service by this general examination continued right up until the 1980s, when departments assumed responsibility for recruitment themselves. But the principles of fair and open competition and appointment on merit remain the cornerstone of civil service recruitment. Life and work in the civil service was also described vividly in other works of Trollope, including Marion Fay, John Caldergate, and the gem of a short story, The Telegraph Girl. In Marion Fay, we are introduced to the character of George Roden, who is a modest clerk in the post office, who later succeeds to the Italian dukedom of Crinola through his mother's line. Trollope gives us a tantalising glimpse of Victorian office politics. In this extract, the Aeolus is Sir Boreas Bodkin, the secretary of the office, whom Trollope modelled on his own superior at the post office, Lieutenant Colonel Maberley. But I realise this one's quite long, but I think we've just about got enough time. Roden was generally popular at his office, and he had contrived to make his occupation there pleasant to himself and interesting. But he had his little troubles, as will happen to most men in all walks of life. His came to him chiefly from the ill manners of a fellow clerk who sat in the same room with him and at the same desk. There were 5 who occupied the apartment, an elderly gentleman and 4 youngsters. The elderly gentleman was a quiet, civil, dull old man who never made himself disagreeable and was content to put up with the frivolities of youth, if they did not become too uproarious or antagonistic to discipline. When they did, he had but one word of rebuke: "Mr. Crocker, I will not have it." Beyond that, he'd never been known to go in either way, either of reporting the misconduct of his subordinates to other superior powers, or in quarrelling with the young man himself. Even Mr. Crocker, who no doubt was troublesome, he contrived to maintain terms of outward friendship. His name was Jerningham, and next to Mr. Jerningham in age came Mr. Crocker, by whose ill-timed witticisms our George Roden was not infrequently made to suffer. This had sometimes gone so far that Roden had contemplated the necessity of desiring Mr. Crocker to assume that a bond of enmity had been established between them, or in other words, they were not to speak except on official subjects. But there had been an air of importance about such a proceeding, of which Crocker hardly seemed to be worthy, and Roden had abstained, putting off the evil hour from day to day, but still conscious that he must do something to stop vulgarities which are distasteful to him. The 2 other young men, Mr. Bobbin and Mr. Geratley, who sat at a table by themselves and were the 2 junior clerks in that branch of the office, were pleasant and good-humoured enough. They were both young and as yet not very useful to the Queen. They were apt to come late to their office and impatient to leave it when the hour of 4 drew nigh. There would sometimes come a storm through the department, moved by an unseen but powerful and unsatisfied Aeolus, in which Bobbin and Gorakli would be threatened to be blown into infinite space. Minutes would be written and rumours spread about. Punishments would be inflicted, and it would be given to be understood that now one and then the other would certainly have to return to his disconsolate family at the very next offence. There was a question at this very moment whether Gorakli, who'd come from the sister island about 12 months since, should not be returned to King's County. No doubt he'd passed the civil service examinations with distinguished applause, but Aeolus hated the young Crichtons who came to him with full marks, and he declared that Gorakli, though no doubt a linguist, a philosopher, and a mathematician, was not worth his salt as a post office clerk. But he and Bobbin also were protected by Mr. Jerningham, and so were well liked by George Roden. It's easy to see how that passage surely must have been influenced by Trollope's real experiences. John Caldegat also gives us a glimpse of the sort of detailed casework that specialist civil servants have always undertaken. The character of Samuel Bagwax, not one of Trollope's most believable names, is a postal clerk with an unrivaled knowledge of postage marks and stamps from around the world. He proved conclusively that a letter addressed to Caldegat's lady friend Euphemia Smith as Mrs. Caldegat was in fact a forgery, as the Sydney postmark it bore had not been issued at the time, thus clearing our hero's name. And at the same time, he loses the chance of a trip to Australia. Bagwax was a man who, in his official zeal and official capacity, had exercised his intellect far beyond the matters to which he was bound to apply himself and the mere performance of his duties. Postmarks were his business, and he had given all his mind to postmarks. He would have sufficiently carried out that great doctrine of doing the duty which England expects from every man. But he had travelled beyond postmarks and had looked into many things. Amongst other matters, he had looked into penny stamps, twopenny stamps, and other stamps. In post office phraseology, there is sometimes a confusion because the affixed effigy of Her Majesty's head, which represents the postage paid, is called a stamp. And the postmarks or impressions indicating the names of towns are also called stamps. These postmarks or impressions had been the work of Bagwax's life, but his zeal, his joy in the office, and the general energy of his disposition had opened up to him also all the mysteries of the Queen's heads. That stamp, that effigy, that twopenny Queen's head, which by its presence on the corner of the envelope purported to have been the price of conveying the letter from Sydney to Nobble on the 10th of May, 1873, had certainly been manufactured and sent out to the colony since that date. There are signs invisible to ordinary eyes, which are as plain as the sun at noonday to the initiated. It is so in all arts, in all sciences. Bagwax was at once sure of his fact. You will be relieved, though, that Bagwax, despite his findings, did get to go to Australia after all, allowing him to save up for his planned wedding. In a short story called The Telegraph Girl, we have a rare glimpse of working women at the time. Lucy Graham and Sophie Wilson work for the Telegraph Office. When Sophie becomes very ill, she's transferred to the Hastings office to enjoy the sea air, a generous employment at the time. In fact, interestingly, Trollope also wrote an article for the Cornhill magazine about the work of the Telegraph Office and actually promoted the work of women at the time. So Trollope worked continuously at the post office from 1834 to 1867, firstly as a junior clerk in a secretary's office of the General Post Office, where the salary he started on gradually rose from £90 to £180, a sum he found very hard to live on. In 1841, he applied successfully for a newly created role as a postal surveyor. what we today would call an operational management role. As we know, this took him to Ireland, where he gained the insights behind his Irish novels. He returned to England in 1851, only to return to Ireland 2 years later, though he did leave on overseas missions. In 1859, he finally left Ireland for the surveyorship of Eastern England, settling in Hertfordshire. Despite a successful career, he does appear to have ruffled some feathers. In 1855, he wrote a critical article in the Dublin University magazine. In 1860, he testified before a parliamentary committee against the suitability of civil service examinations for junior entrants to the post office, and also succeeded in antagonising the head of the service by organising a series of lectures for post office employees on literary subjects, and then using his own slot to criticise the management style of his superiors. He was not promoted again, despite his groundbreaking work to reorganise postal districts in London, which still has a legacy today. In 1877, he finally left the service. As he described in his autobiography, in 1867, I made up my mind to take a step in life which was not unattended with peril, which many would call rash, and which, when taken, I should be sure at some period to regret. This step was the resignation of my place in the post office. I've described how it was that I contrived to combine the performance of its duties with my other avocations in life. I got up always very early, but even this did not suffice. I worked always on Sundays, as to which no scruple of religion made me unhappy, and not infrequently I was driven to work at night. In the winter, when hunting was going on, I had to keep myself very much on the alert, and during the London season, when I was generally 2 or 3 days of the week in town, I found the official work to be a burden. I determined some years previously, after due consideration with my wife, to abandon the post office when I had put by an income equal to the pension to which I should be entitled if I remained in the department till I was 60. This I had now done, and I sighed for liberty. He does emphasise, though, that he was committed to his salaried role. He stated that a man who takes public money without earning it is to me so odious that I can find no pardon for him in my heart. I have known many such, and some who have craved the power to do so. Nothing would annoy me more than to think that I should even be supposed to have been among the number. Then he goes on to say that he's still a little sore on the subject. And as I would not have it imagined after my death that I had slighted the public service to which I belonged, I will venture here to give the reply which was sent to the letter containing my resignation. Sir, I've received your letter of the 3rd inst, to which you tender your resignation as surveyor in the post office service, and state as to your reason for this step, that you have adopted another profession, the exigencies of which are so great as to make you feel you cannot give to the duties of the post office that amount of attention which you consider the Postmaster General has a right to expect. You have for many years ranked among the most conspicuous members of the post office, which on several occasions, when you have been employed on large and difficult matters, has reaped much benefit from the great abilities which you have been able to place at its disposal. And in mentioning this, I have been especially glad to record that, notwithstanding the many calls upon your time, you have never permitted your other avocations to interfere with your post office work, which has been faithfully and indeed energetically performed. And that was signed J. Tilley. And thus here we come to the end of Trollope's salaried career, but not indeed his interest in the civil service, which continued to influence his later novels. So what was the legacy of his deep interest in the work of civil servants? Literature since Trollope has few examples of characters who are civil servants. One exception is Trollope's successor and biographer, C.P. Snow, whose Strangers and Brothers novel series has a protagonist, Lewis Eliot, who worked as a civil servant as part of a very varied portfolio career, including the law and academia. Are there any similarities between the civil service of the mid-19th century and today? I'd say as a working civil servant, I'd say no, not really. Although clearly today's civil service code can surely trace its DNA back to that time. First published in 1996 and enshrined in law in 2010, this sets out the core civil service values and standards of behaviour expected of all civil servants in upholding these values. Integrity, putting the obligations of public service above personal interests. Honesty, being truthful and open. Objectivity, basing advice and decisions on rigorous analysis of the evidence. Impartiality, acting solely according to the merits of the case and serving governments of different political parties equally well. And of course, recruitment to the civil service is now on the basis of fair and open competition based around a set of behaviours and skills rather than neat handwriting. So thank you very much.
Many thanks, Lucia. Let me just stop the recording.